So next, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use methodology that we're currently used to, if you'd say that, in our design and research when we're talking about UX and IA. But I want to tell a little story. So I was participating in a user study with a few of our panelists where I got to do this experience with room scale VR. So it was a game simulation, kind of an interactive narrative type thing, and I had a headset on and was in a room with controllers and just fully immersed in this experience where I'm crawling through a cave and trying to climb up this wall. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced something like that. And then about a week later, one of the students who had organized the study was showing me a video. It was just a trailer to kind of explain what this environment was, and my immediate reaction was, hey, I was there. And I was like, whoa, like, I wasn't there. That's not a real place. How was that my immediate reaction? So we're talking about completely immersive environments in the case of VR and certain things with AR where this is a totally different experience for users than when you're just looking at a screen. Like, I've never had that reaction to an app before. So I want to talk about how we can leverage some of the existing approaches and think about, for this entirely new paradigm, what do we need to do to either exploit the things that we're using or just completely start fresh?
One thing that is really interesting with VR is that you're not, usually when we're used to designing experiences for digital worlds, we design for screens, so we're used to rules of composition and having a very limited space to work with and having a frame and guiding the eye with the usual visual design rules that we've learned. But in virtual reality, these don't exist. You don't have a limited field of view. It's everywhere around you. So it's a lot more like designing experiences for the real physical space than it is for actually designing out of digital experiences. And another thing is that the VR field is not actually new. Research has been done for more than 20 years in it. It's just been exploding now, and the medium is finally becoming more accessible to the general public, and that is really why we hear about it a lot more. That is what the technology has been doing.
So I'll tell a story about my own personal experience about designing for VR. So I was trying to do a study where I would invite participants and ask them to design their own, like create their own designs for, so I was creating like pop-ups for VR, and I wanted them to come up with the designs. But then I realized that like for a mobile screen, you can give a wireframe, you can give a sketch, but that's not exactly so easily done in VR. So the thought I had was, what if I create a fake 3D room structure? Like I create an actual real world environment. I put desks, I put tabletops, I put like computers, phones, whatever that I wish to have in a VR world. And then I make people wear a cardboard glass with actually nothing there. So it's kind of a simulation where you put the person there in a fake room, wearing a fake glass, and then you ask them to design for that environment. So I haven't really tested out that, but that was something that I felt that might be a counterpart for wireframing, like wireframing as we know it for mobile screens, might be, like that might be the way to go forward with VR. So doing that study, I also realized that it's kind of very difficult to perform participatory design with VR. So if you know about participatory design, it basically involves involving all your stakeholders in the design process, right? But there is one thing, like it depends on a common level of knowledge for all the stakeholders. Like, for example, if I design something for the mobile phone, I know that everybody uses it, and it's very easy to find people who will give you insights about that. But for VR, it's not yet as ubiquitous as a mobile phone. So I think there was this paper where they had to do a 4-day workshop to get people to a certain level of knowledge before they could start doing a participatory design process. So I think that's something that doesn't extend so well from our digital world to our VR world.
So I think with augmented reality, one very particularly important term to consider is flow. The flow of your digital content into the real world and your relationship your digital content has with the real world. So, for example, if everybody looked at the exit sign behind you right now, is that what we want our augmented reality to look like? A bunch of hanging signs. So we have to think about how we design and display these things. And that's really important. We don't necessarily want to walk around in a meme-verse where everything has, white fonts and black outlines around it. When we're talking about designing for virtual environments, it's incredibly helpful to actually think of theater. So if we look back at performance spaces and the way that set designers and scenographers, which is sort of the theoretical set designers from Europe, the way they design spaces to facilitate certain interactions and experiences, we can actually learn a lot to help us design sort of pathways or prime our users to make particular choices in the experiences we create.
So I think, right, in traditional user experience design or in the design field for digital artifacts, you think about this concept of affordances, right? A button should look like it's a button because it affords that action to click on it. In VR, at least in my experience, that principle still exists, and it's still very much talked about in the project that I worked on. I think of it more as like similar to like interior design, right, of a room, or like the design of a physical chair or something, right? A chair affords the action of sitting on it because it looks like a chair. It has these qualities. In VR, you still have to design digital artifacts to have those affordances, right? And it's a little bit harder because you don't necessarily have the tactile feedback of sitting down on a chair or feeling the handle on a mug or something. And of course, you are still limited to the type of input you have to the virtual world, which is things like controllers or gloves or things like that. But the artifacts that you design in virtual reality, at least, should have that same concept of affordances. And another technique that we used in my project was sort of like a wireframe, but also sort of like a blueprint. And I did a lot of research about how architects use blueprints to plan out their spaces. And because you're designing a 3D space, a virtual environment, using blueprints to sort of map out how a person will walk through, at least in room scale VR, how a person will walk through your space is hugely helpful. And we went through the whole process of using trace paper and overlaying pieces of trace paper over on top of each other to see where, how can we design the pathway that a person will take in the virtual environment using that technique. So we thought that was very helpful.
So in my experience, I feel the design process of the traditional UX like web and app and the VR and AR is still very similar. It's just a consideration should be much broader. For example, in my AR project for aquarium, I first identify the problem that people use the existing app cannot find a specific target easily. Like if I want to know whale shark, I have to go down the top-down menu and scroll all the way down to find W, and it's very troublesome. So I figure out, oh, maybe I can use augmented reality to serve that. So I designed an active fish menu that will have some animated fish floating in front of your screen, and you can just click on that as a menu. So you can click on it and navigate to the desired, like the fish or check out the dolphin showtime. And during that process, I think one different thing about from the UX design is that there's just only few examples I can refer to. So when I do the brainstorm, I have to look up the so the research part is more difficult. More like you have to brainstorm yourself and try out, like sketch down, get feedback from people. But also when I do the prototype, it's not as easy as you just do a 2D screen. I have to hand code in Unity 3D and get the feedback from people. But I think the whole process is still very similar. Like I do user testing and iterate on my design and then get feedback from them. Yeah, so I think as we have more people develop design in AR or VR, and we can have more reference for that, we all get experience on that. We will have more concrete research resource for that.
So I want to relate this back to what Andrew was talking about. He talked a lot about labels in language. Do these things carry the same weight? Do you have to think about them in the same way as a designer when we're talking about these more immersive experiences? Can we use the same types of methods? Do they need to change? Or, I don't know, what do we think about that?
So for personal,
Yeah, in a moment.
yeah, so for my personal experience, I feel a very distinct difference between app and web design and VR AR is that VR AR has a very specific context you need to design for. For example, if you are doing an immersive story, you have to, I made a werewolf transforming experience in VR, and I have to look up the werewolf lycanthropy story, and also I have to understand what's the world, like the medical era, what does it look like. So you really need to know, just like the content and language are very important, you really need to know what's the specific context in that story.
So labels is one, and I think or labels and language. I think the theme that applies from that to VR and AR is consistency, right? The way in which you present content may not have text labels, but it does have to have a visual consistency because that's how people create relationships, which was the second thing that Andrew talked about as information architects. The relationships that people form in VR are now three-dimensional, right? So a digital artifact that I see over here may relate to something that I experienced 2 minutes ago, and that was behind me, right? It's no longer limited to this 2D screen, and I think that's something that very much so applies to the design of virtual and augmented environments.
I could rant and rave about this for a long time, so I'm really going to try to keep it short. So when we're talking about augmented reality, specifically in designing labels, we have to really appreciate the immediacy of the labels we're creating, especially in GPS contextually aware devices. When I'm walking down the street and I'm immediately giving labels to everything that I look at, I'm immediately being informed and directed to make certain kinds of decisions that are probably based off of something that I don't get to choose. This is not how I particularly would like to live my life. It's something that we need to figure out and design around. And as the medium grows, it's something that we have to really figure out how to regulate. In virtual reality, you have the claim that VR creates empathy. And this is an incredibly dangerous claim for VR practitioners to make and people in the information architecture world to take. When we make the claim of empathy, we make a claim of truly understanding someone. So next time you hear this claim, I'd urge you to ask yourself if just being around something means you completely understand what someone is going through. All right, that's the claim that people make. So when we're designing these things, we're not necessarily designing for empathy, we're designing for a higher sense of awareness, which may hopefully engender empathy, but it's not a one-to-one.
What Josh said.
I think one of the problems with virtual reality is that we are trying to convince someone's brain that they are actually in a different space. So if there are labels floating around items around you, it's going to constantly remind you that you are not actually there and that this is a digital world. So in many ways, there's a completely new thinking that needs to be done as we're trying to convince the user that this is a real world and a real place that they're in. So because of that, there will be differences between the way we think about designing experiences for screens versus virtual reality.
That's a very interesting question. We do have one service design course at Georgia Tech, which is in the industrial design department. So in service design, you talk about this concept of touch points, right? As not only, let's say, a mobile app, but the whole experience that a person has with a business and all the different points of contact that a person has. In VR, at least, to my experience, and I never actually thought about this until you brought it up, but it is actually quite similar because in a virtual environment, and obviously this depends on the application that you're building, you are designing, like I said, a three-dimensional space that a person, you have to design for that interaction. Your designs have to make people feel like they can interact in this world, and designing the touch points that a person has in a virtual space is similar to that with in service design, I believe.
So thankfully, there are already some experiences that are beginning to do that. So what Jasmine was talking about was a room scale experience where you can actually naturally walk through the space as if you would down the street. And you can do, outside of walking, you can do some interactions that, like hammering that mirror actual interactions. So there is there is not exactly parity yet between what we can do in real life and in virtual reality, but we're getting there. One of the things that kind of allows us to do that, though, is to rethink how we design and create virtual environments. So when we have when we present a virtual environment for someone, right, that's like full of possibilities, we can't really direct someone's movement. If I put an open field, I have no idea which direction you're going to walk in. But if I can create structures that direct you to walk in certain ways, I can keep you from hitting your walls and your couch, and you can have a really enjoyable experience.
I'd like to add to that, so haptic feedback is one of the major problems that is being worked on right now. You can see gloves, you can see like exoskeleton-like controllers. So there was this very interesting work done by CMU where they call it haptic retargeting. So what they did was they had 3 virtual cubes, which if you want to grab, you can't really grab them. Like your hands would go through them because they're virtual. So, but what they did was they put the participants in a room and they showed 3 physical cubes. Then they immersed the participants and then they took away 2 cubes. So right now the situation is you see 3 cubes in the virtual world, but you have only 1 cube in the physical world. So now what they tell them is go for the left cube, and then they shift the virtual world in a way that when they reach for it, they're actually reaching for the middle cube, which is in the physical world. So they're reutilizing 1 cube to show 3 virtual cubes by just shifting the world in slight ways, which are unnoticeable by you when you are moving your head. So I think tricks like that will play a great part in actually giving you that haptic feedback by utilizing minimal physical objects.
There's also new products that are being done to, for example, allow you to create external devices that can be programmed and then that are tied into the virtual world. So there is research that is being done exactly in that direction.
So in my project of werewolf transforming experience, we did a lot of audio cue. Like when you transform, you have a more acute hearing sense of ability. So you actually hear your heartbeat being increase, sound increase. And also, since in VR environment, you have the 360-degree sound. So it's also one designed to guide your user, because you want, for example, if there is a door, when you hear someone knocking on the door from the aspect, you can make the user turn to that. So I think sound is a very important part to guide the user in that as a cue, and also to add on the real feeling, like, oh, right now you are the werewolf, you are not a human, something like that.
So sound design is actually very interesting because in current like 2D experiences, you have things called auditory displays, right? So you know, I click a button and I hear a ding, right? That communicates some piece of information. In 3D immersive environments, sound designers, I think, or sound designers play a much larger role in the experience that someone will have, because now that sound can be localized, right? Spatialized audio, right? I can hear a sound coming from behind me, and that, like Tika said in her experience, can cause me to turn around and look at something. And so sound designers I think will play a huge role in future VR experiences, because essentially they are communicating some information through sound. And now the role of that information is much larger than it has been traditionally.
I'm currently working on a mixed reality exhibit in Sweden with some colleagues, and we're doing some actually interesting stuff with sound design. The specific exhibit is you would walk through this installation, and there would be windows that you could peer into that would give you an insight into 1916 Malmö. So there's sound that happens inside of these rooms, and there's sound that happens historically just of the ambient street sound of 1916 of Sweden. So we have audio that's designed and very specific, that's based around the room, based on true geographic and physical locations, but also a pervasive audio that ties everything together, a diegetic audio that puts it all. So you can sort of think about individual experience audio tying into greater atmospheric soundscapes, which actually creates a more cohesive experience.
So I think sound, because it's binaural, like it's basically localized sound, and you can actually understand where the sound is coming from in a VR context. It makes a lot of sense to use the sound to actually direct people's gaze. So if you can hear something like somebody's footsteps at the back of your head, you're bound to turn around and look at it. So that way, when you're creating VR experiences, you can use sound to kind of direct where people are looking, to kind of so that they follow the path that you meant them to follow. Another thing is, it reminds me of a study done in Georgia Tech. So they were designing a auditory display for people with visual disability, like blind people. So what they did was, it's really hard to test out them because you don't want people to test your system on the streets and then face accidents. So in VR world, they designed an environment with sound spaces, and they could actually test out with people following those sounds without any visual cues. And I think that's a very innovative way of using sound design for testing.
I want to move on to make sure that we have time to cover the last topic. So next, I want to talk a little bit about diversity with respect to people in AR and VR experiences. So again, we're talking about highly immersive environments in a lot of cases in which part of the experience may involve a sense of identity. So Tiga's talking about, like, you're a werewolf in a game, but in a lot of cases, you're going to play yourself. You are now a character in this experience. So if you look down in the VR experience and you expect to see something that represents you in some way. So I want to actually talk a little bit about the stakeholders that are all involved and discuss whose responsibility is it to take these things into consideration. At what point in the process do we need to be thinking about these things, and who needs to make calls about this and spend a lot of time and energy thinking about it?
I think the answer is just everyone. I mean, it's everyone's responsibility. It's something everyone should be thinking of throughout every step of the process.
I think it also depends a lot on the market you're targeting. Like right now, if you look at the VR headsets and the hardware, they're very, very expensive. We have access to it. I think I'm fortunate to have access to it, but I know like many, many brilliant people, producers, like in different parts of the world do not have access to those things. And I think once the technology becomes cheaper to gain access, the representation would change, because then you would actually want to reach a more diverse market, and you have to have representation to do that.
The tool makers. The biggest obstacles to diversity in new mediums are not having the right tools and it being societal. Let's hope that we are moving past the societal issues and dealing with tool issues. I was recently at a conference in Amsterdam where they were doing 3D modeling of objects, and the only bodies that they were, 3D bodies, and the only bodies that they were modeling were white Caucasian bodies. That's incredibly problematic. All right, so as we move into this space, we have to make sure that we're creating tools that are inclusive of everybody, so that when the designers start working, those things are available and you can achieve diversity. Part of creating languages that are easy to create these experiences is it allows that diversity to happen. All right, so let's focus on making sure that our tool makers are held accountable in doing this.
So I tend to think of this problem from the other aspect. So I think from technology to designer to content producers, they all have the responsibility for this question. I think, for example, myself, even though I'm really enthusiastic about VR, but every time I use VR, like Cardboard or Gear VR, gets sick very badly. So like when I download the app from Google and use it in Cardboard, like every app I just try out for 30 seconds and I just take it off. It's just really making me nauseous. And I think, of course, the technology will improve in a few years, but I think that's a problem that maybe the technology inventor need to take the responsibility, because like maybe women or elderly people or children will have more tendency to get sick. They won't have the approach or freedom to use these tools. And also, like for designer, when we design the contents for maybe tech-savvy people who are tech-savvy or love travel, but we just ignore the history or humanity subject, then people who are interested in that won't have the chance to use this technology as well. Yeah. And I remember when I went to the immersive storytelling symposium a few weeks ago in New York, all the VR researchers and practitioners, they all mentioned heavily on the content creation. They say content quality and it needs to be authentic. For example, you are doing a refugee documentary, but you are from the aspect of an outsider. So during the symposium, I heard their emphasis on the contents. Like when they did a Syria refugee documentary, they actually went there and know their story and try to make story from their points of view, and they also expect in the future there is an affordance for this medium for people to create their own story there. So it will be more just like a web content. Everyone can contribute to that, so it can really make sure everyone has equal accessibility to the content and the media.
I think anybody who considers themselves an advocate for the user is uniquely responsible, or has this responsibility to ensure diverse audiences, right, are accounted in these experiences. And I'll tell you why from a project that I worked on. So I was involved in creating that experience that Jasmine was talking about with the caves and the narrow passageways and things like that. And through this experience, right, this is room scale VR, people are walking through these really tight cave crevices. And so at the end of this project, we did a user study earlier in January, I believe it was, 15 participants. And what we got from the qualitative feedback we got from one of our interviews was that one of the participants did not finish the experience because he saw the visual affordances of these narrow passageways and said, based on my body size, I wouldn't think that I would fit through that. So, I just stopped. I just stopped moving. And we would have, we never even thought that was going to be an issue, right? We were so hyped about this interaction, this really cool space, VR, right? We didn't even think about that. But because evaluation and research was part of our process, right? Sort of a UX, a usability test of our experience, we were able to find out that information. And that makes us responsible for passing that information to, if we were in a team, to the designers, or, as part of this iterative process. And that's why I think that people who are in UX design and UX research and who are trained to think this way and to have these processes, I think we are the ones responsible for making sure that information gets communicated into the final designs.
Well, there are tools currently being made to create the artwork in virtual reality. So there are applications like Quill that allows you to draw in virtual reality. And these can be exported as 3D models and then implemented into virtual reality worlds. So there's already some tools that exist to create virtual reality worlds in virtual reality. For the screen, there's also applications that allow you to enter a virtual reality world and just have a screen that kind of wraps around you and just enjoy your computer in space with a screen in front of you. But I think that's kind of where tools are going to evolve right now. They're kind of raw. So they exist, but they're not, you can't do things on the same level as you can using a screen just because the tools aren't that evolved yet. I honestly can't see that virtual reality will be worked on in virtual reality a year from now, but I could see that happening further down the road.
One thing I'd like to point out is when you're seeing a screen floating in front of you, yeah, it's not like it's screenless. You are actually seeing that screen on a screen. So it's not moving away from a screen. It's just moving you to another screen. And I'm also not really a big fan of having screens floating in the midair because I don't think that's the purpose of VR. And you have to utilize the affordances of the space of having a 3D area around you. And the screen is basically a 2D object hanging in midair, which kind of doesn't, it's not believable enough. And from my side, I'm not convinced by that, and I would say, again, don't follow I hope Magic Leap doesn't follow the Google Glass path and doesn't offer what they show.
Kind of echoing that, since it's Magic Leap, I'll believe it when I see it. They've got billions and billions of dollars of investment, but they haven't really shown us anything yet, only a few videos. And one of them wasn't even real. So, there's a lot that we still need to see from that company. In terms of what happens when we remediate, essentially, into these new forms, I think what you're going to have is you're going to have a fair amount of people who are going to try the screen thing, but we're going to really see from audiences that's not an enjoyable experience. I come from an English composition and poetry background. The people that I originally worked with still hold on to the book as the true way to read and like refuse to jump on a web page or on Medium and what have you, or use their Kindle. So I think there's going to be some, I'm hesitant to say this, but like legacy sort of interactions that stick around. I think what we're going to see with things like virtual reality is that it's going to be more about experiences and simulations and less so about sort of this dual sort of mediation where it's I'm reading a text and I'm imagining it. It's just going to be there in front of me.
I gotta wrap it up now. So thank you so much to all of our panelists.